Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Ride Mechanic channel. How the heck are you doing today? On today's video, I wanted to talk... What the... Crap, the power's out. Well, let's talk about what parks do during a power outage. Well, get ready. Here we go. Psst. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Ride Mechanic channel. Thank you for coming back and watching another video. I do appreciate it. If this is your first time here, make sure you like and subscribe so you can see more content by me. Alright, today's video, I want to talk about power outages and... Oh, that's better. I want to talk about power outages and basically what the park can do for them, what they can do to prepare for them. So first off, most parks cannot prepare for a power outage. By that I mean just get ahead of the actual event. The majority of power outages happen spontaneously. Nobody really knows when they're coming. Some instances where the grid is extremely loaded during the hot summer months and things like that where everyone's running their air conditioners. Some power companies might choose to do rolling blackouts in the area, which would drop the power out to the theme park. Well, they don't have to, but the theme park tries to get ahead of that and says, like, if you could just give us like a 10-minute heads up, we could start unloading rides and make it much more convenient for everybody. But most of the time, the power district won't do a heads up on something like that, because if they did, that would be basically letting people know that something was going to happen, and then people could go places and like wait for alarm systems to turn off and things like that. So they typically just don't broadcast that information. So when we talk about power outages, we're basically going to divide them into two different categories. The first category is going to be what's called a blip, B-L-I-P, a power blip, and the second one is going to be a full outage. So the difference between those two is that a power blip is, a lot of you probably have experienced these all the time, where you're sitting around and the power just momentarily goes out and back on just for a second. That's what's considered a blip. That's not an official term or a standard term or anything like that. It's just a blip of power. It shuts off, it comes back on. That messes up everything in an amusement park, absolutely. The second type we're going to talk about is a full power outage. That's the one where the lights go off completely and they don't come back on, and you call this the provider up and say, hey, when you guys have an ETA fixing the power in this area? They say, we don't know when the power is going to come back up to that area at all. So the impact of those two events. Let's talk about the blip versus an outage. In the maintenance world, I would much rather have a full outage than anything else. I would much rather experience the full outage because it gives me time to do stuff. And the blip, they're momentary, they go out, they come back on. Sometimes they do it multiple times. Sometimes they'll drop out 2 or 3 times within a span of like 5 minutes, while something was maybe switch gear changing over or something along those lines. Let's talk about the impact that those two have on the rides. The first one is the easy one, that's the one I prefer, that's a full power outage. A full power outage on a ride is very simple. It is exactly like just walking up to the ride and just clicking the key to the off position, everything turns off. That's my best case scenario, honestly. That's the one I prefer. And then what do we do during that time? What do we do when the lights go out? Well, the maintenance divides into multiple areas, but one of the first things we have to do for every single ride out there, no matter what it is we have to get to its motor control center, which is typically where you lock the ride out. And we have to get to that motor control center and turn the main power off. We have to isolate that ride from the rest of the power. And that is extremely important to do. For the power blips, there's really nothing you can do. By the time you start to react to that power going out, the power's back on. And unfortunately, that power coming back on within a couple seconds, that's what actually does the damage to a lot of rides. So if you've ever been at a park where there's a power blip, where the power came off for a couple minutes and then came right back on, and then they lost a handful of rides and they didn't come up the rest of the day, those rides were actually damaged by the power being turned off and they come back on. I'll explain that here in just a minute. So operators, as far as they're concerned, as soon as that power blip happens, they notice that the ride stops. It stops operation. Spinning rides take a little bit longer for the operator to notice because they have to wind down. There's typically nothing like massive that happens when they turn that power off. So they pretty much, all ride operators are pretty much trained to hit the e-stop when the power goes off. And they stop all motion in the ride. And then they have to try to call up base, radio base, something like that, radio their central control and say, hey, my ride lost power. Because as far as the operator is concerned at that point, they pretty much can't assume the entire park lost power. Maybe, not necessarily. They have to assume it was just their ride for some reason. You think about rides that are more isolated where they can't see a lot of other rides running. Maybe they're in a tree area and they're kind of off by themselves. So those rides are just like, I don't know, my ride lost power. That's all I know. A power outage to them looks the exact same way as if we turn the circuit breaker off back at the main power feed. Just went, turn that guy off. That ride would behave the same exact way. The damage I was talking about a second ago, the damage is done during power blips or power failures where you haven't been able to go around and throw that main disconnect to the off position. The damage is done when the power comes back on. Because what happens is when they restore power to the area, there is a very large wave of incoming power that rushes into that ride. And it's a large inrush, called inrush current, that goes into the motor control center. And basically where the ride's used to having a voltage in a very defined parameter, it's like the voltage always operates in this little bit of a parameter right there. Not only did we go below it because we lost power, but when the power comes back on, we went into that defined parameter and then went way over it. And then it came back down and started to stabilize. Now that happens very quick. It's just a split second when that power inrush happens. But that inrush causes circuit breakers to trip, it causes fuses to blow, causes all sorts of bad things to happen inside that motor control center. So when maintenance tries to go back and restore the ride back to its working condition, a lot of times you'll go to the panel and you'll turn it on and then go up to the ride control cabinet where the operator stands and start to try to run the ride back up, and it doesn't turn on. It doesn't work. So it's like, okay, what's happening? So you go back downstairs, turn off the main disconnect again, and you turn it back on. You know, the old cycle, the ON/OFF switch. That's a technical term. And then you go back upstairs, and then you say, or back out to the control cabinet, and you say, okay, let's try this again. And you try it again, it still doesn't work. Well, it's probably a blown fuse or a tripped circuit breaker. Now, both of those problems are kind of hidden a lot of times. Most of the time when you blow a fuse or trip a circuit breaker, the ride honestly doesn't immediately know it has a problem, or it might have tripped to something that actually monitors the problem. So if I trip a circuit breaker to the PLC, well, the ride will never turn back on. There's nothing to tell me that the circuit breaker is tripped to the PLC. All I know is I turn the incoming power on, and that PLC stays dark. No lights, no blinking, no nothing. So it's like, okay, something else going on there. And a lot of times there are remote junction boxes around the ride that also have circuit breakers and fuses inside of them. So when you're working where the base controller is, where the bulk of that controller is, it's not necessarily something right there that you're just going to open up the cabinet and look in and just go, yep, oh, right there. Yep, that's the one, and turn it back on. That's not necessarily the case. Circuit breakers can be located all over the place, and then the type of circuit breaker that's used is different all over the ride for all sorts of different reasons. So you might have one that's got a big knob on the front that simply when it shunts, when it turns off, it goes to the off position, it rotates 90 degrees. So it's like, okay, you could visually see it, easy, got it. Some of them have simply just a little tiny button on the front that pushes out, only by about 1 millimeter too. So you're stuck looking at maybe 15, 20, 30 circuit breakers, and that aren't, again, not in the exact same place. They're kind of located everywhere. And people say, well, why wouldn't you put the circuit breakers all in the same place? It's like, for motor control, that's easy. When I have 30 motors on a ride, like a B&M that's got booster drives all over it, I have circuit breakers all in that one cabinet. And it's like, yes, that's good. For smaller stuff, lots of remote I/O and things like that around the ride, they may have chosen to deliver a higher voltage out to a cabinet and then step it down for lower control voltage in that same cabinet. Well, there's circuit breakers, there's controls inside there. So it's like, okay, those are not in the cabinet. You might have to go catwalks, gratings, in high spaces, top of the lift hill. Like, you don't know where those things are going to be located. So, and again, the ride might not know it has a problem. It might go to turn something on and just no motion happens. So the ride just says fault because there's no motion when I'm telling it to. It doesn't tell you there's a tripped circuit breaker. It just says it tried to move something forward and it couldn't, so it faulted. So in those MCC panels and other MCC standing for motor control cabinet, in the MCC panels and those remote panels I'm talking about all over the ride, there are also fuses. Fuses in there, they blow and they don't reset, and there's no real clear indicator on them that they're blown. So most of the time it takes a controls person coming around, like I used to do controls. So I would come around and I would see a strip of fuses. There'd be like 50 of them in a row. So one by one, I'd have to open the little thing up and pull the little tiny, most of the time they're made by Little Fuse. They're little tiny glass bus fuses, kind of like you'd find in your house on some stuff. And you would have to test those, take a multimeter out and test them. And I say do that because, well, you could see the filament in the center, but sometimes those things don't bust and blow the filament apart dead center. They sometimes break right at the cap on the inside, and the cap's got a cup on it, so the filament comes off inside the cap and you can't see it. So in those cases you have a blown fuse, but when you look at the center where you would typically see the fuse element separated in the middle like that, that fuse element looks completely fine. And it's like, nope, that fuse is actually blown, but you don't know until you take a multimeter and stick your multimeter leads across the fuse. Now, the big problem with doing that is I'll use my mouse here. So if this is my fuse, this top part right here, about 1 inch, is conductive, and the bottom part right here is also conductive. And that glass part is right in the middle. Well, if I'm holding a big fuse like this, it's not a big deal because I put my finger right in the middle of it, and then I take my multimeter, positive and negative, and I simply touch it to the conductive parts like that, and I'll tell whether it's blown or not. But when you shrink this down to something that's only that big, so they're only about 20 millimeters tall, then, if you shrink that down proportionally, then my finger is like this big. And then when I hold that fuse like that, now my finger is bridging the gap between the bottom and the top. Some people don't understand that their finger's still conductive when you're checking stuff at a fuse level. So they put their finger, accidentally bridge the gap, or the thumb, and bridge the gap between the two, especially if it's hot, sweaty, the conductivity is high, or the moisture is high to make conductivity high. And then they put their multimeter across it. It can't go through the element in the center because the element in the center is blown. But it can go through your hand. Now this is resistance we're talking about. So you won't feel anything. It's not like you're not getting shocked from that. But when you do that and put it on there, the multimeter, you'll see the resistance value start dropping or start going up. And then it's like, okay, so once you see the needle start to move and you see the values start to go all over the place, you're like, okay, it's got an element inside of there, it's connected. What you'd be looking for is an overload scenario, which is your meter with both prongs in the air. It'll say overload. And if you touch it to a blown fuse, it also says overload. And if you touch the two together, the resistance starts dropping down to mega ohms and then ohms, and pretty soon it will drop to 0 ohms of resistance between there and say, okay, my meter's working. And then you touch it between there and the overload goes away and that resistance value starts dropping. And you're like, okay, the fuse is good. Next fuse, when in reality, it was bad. There are some fuse holders out there that use diodes on the inside of them, and they go power to the top, power out the bottom, and then when that fuse blows, it causes the power to go through the diode and illuminate a red light on the outside. It's like, why wouldn't you use those for everything? Well, they're very voltage dependent. They also work off the voltage from the control system, so if you're working with something like a low voltage that has to have something exact like 5.8 volts on it or something like that, that diode's going to start eating up some of that voltage and it might throw off the rest of your system. And then the other problem is that when rides malfunction the other way, outside of a power outage, when rides malfunction that other way, then I start calling into question if the fuse holder itself has gone bad and is now letting power just bypass around it, enough to where something can work but not work effectively. So you run into all sorts of problems like that. So checking fuses is what eats up a lot of time when you're troubleshooting rides, and there's no great way to go about it because things can backfeed. That's where you send power out to alternate things and then you blow one fuse, and that fuse that's blown still has power from some of the other fuses underneath the fuse. So you have your hot voltage coming in, but now you have this hot voltage underneath the fuse too. So if you stick your multimeter on there, I know I get a lot of people saying, well, just stick your multimeter on the bottom and measure the voltage at the bottom, if you know what it is. Let's say it's a bank of 24 volt fuses, and you go, yeah, it's at 24, 24, 24, 24, and you get to one, so it's got 24 on it, but that fuse is blown because something else in that circuit is backfeeding voltage to that fuse, to where when you stick your meter on there, it looks like you've got 24 volts, but in reality, that fuse is blown. So lots of time spent during a power outage bringing your rides back up because of all these little electrical gremlins that happened from taking a ride that ran off of, here in the US, like 480 three-phase power, and then we suddenly shot 600 volts to it. Tons of motor overloads and protectors opened up, and tons of fuses blew and all sorts of stuff. So that is why I said earlier, it's absolutely critical while the power is down to get to that equipment and shut that incoming switch off. Because when you turn that switch off, it interrupts the ride, it isolates it. And then when the power comes back on, that disconnect is off. So the power comes back on, you get that huge inrush of current that comes into the park and destroys lots of stuff. And then after 10, 15 minutes, once the power has stabilized and you're sure it's not going to go off again, or hopefully sure it's not going to go off again, then you can start going around to rides and simply turning those switches back on, depending on the state of the ride and what it's in. So I talked about operations. They pretty much just hit the e-stop and call in, say there's a problem with the ride. They lost power at it for some reason. So let's talk about what maintenance does. So maintenance is sitting there. It's a lot of times during the middle of the day when power outages happen. So maintenance is sitting there, and then suddenly the power goes out. At that point, you're indoors, so you know when the building goes out, you hear things throughout the park stop working, and the park goes. You still hear people screaming on rides and stuff like that. That hasn't stopped yet. But you hear this kind of background noise that the park generates. It's all this fluff. It's air conditioners, air handlers, compressors, park music, theming music. All that stuff is just this background gray noise to mechanics. And then what happens is when that power goes out, not only does the light in their building or wherever they are just go bloop and goes off, and they're like, huh, but they listen, and that gray noise from the park has gone away. And there's nothing there except for maybe some people you can hear here and there. And that's when it's like, oh crap, we just lost power. So maintenance has a response to that. And it varies drastically. And I'm talking just it varies so much from park to park, ride to ride, even the exact same ride between different parks is treated differently. So it's very just whatever the park has done, that's what they're going to do. So this is a hard topic to really like say, oh yeah, this is what has to be done every time, because every time the power goes out, there is no clear cut, this exact thing happens every time, because it depends on what state the ride was in when the power goes out. It depends on does the power come back up, and now you have this false sense of security that you're just going to be able to go out there and restart the ride, and then everything's going to be a hunky-dory afterwards. At the park I worked at, we had Vekomas. We had 2 of them. Then Vekomas typically use the older style L4 brakes, which are linear pinch brakes. You see them on all the old Aero rides, Vekoma rides, and stuff like that. Very long, narrow. They use air bladders to close the thing, but that's the problem. They use air to close. So when the power goes out, the air compressor for the ride stops making air pressure. Well, if you have trains sitting in a block that's being held there by air pressure, and if the air pressure goes away, the brake opens, the train rolls out of the block, you're going to crash trains into each other. So rides that have that style brake, which are their air pressure closed, and then if you remove the pressure, they open, you typically have to go to those types of rides first thing, because you start a clock. As soon as the power goes out, you start the clock. The clock starts ticking, and while you're sitting there, that entire air system has all sorts of little tiny leaks all over it, not audible, not anything else, but leaks that you just really can't fix and can't control. That's called bleeding. It's an air system bleeding. So the system starts bleeding with no air compressor running, and then you start losing your air pressure in all the tanks. Now, I can speak for Vekoma rides. You have your big air tank, which holds all the air for the ride, and then you have some thick pipes that go out to all the other sections, which also stores air. And then at each one of those brakes, it's got all sorts of check valves and stuff in place. So a check valve is a valve that's put in line for that air that only allows air to go one way. And when the air tries to go backwards, it stops. So it's literally a spring-loaded ball being pushed up against a seat. So when the air goes this way, it pushes the ball away from the seat and the air goes through. And then as soon as you stop that movement of air, that's flow. As soon as you stop the flow of air, that ball seats back in and prevents the air from going backwards. So you have your big tank, you have your air lines, you have the check valves, and then at every single brake, Vekoma put in another storage tank right there. And those are the ones I've talked about in other videos before, where I've said, well, we do a 20-minute bleed down test. That's where we took the big storage tank and the airline that feeds all those things, and we completely drained them down to 0. And then once they were at 0, we started a 20-minute timer. And that 20-minute timer was to check all those individual brakes and to make sure nothing in that system was bleeding too much. Because if it was bleeding, at the end of 20 minutes, you would find a brake would open. Had that before. And then you go up to that particular one, and you start looking at it, and you re-energize the system and bring the pressure back up, and it's like, oh yeah, you can hear an air leak right here somewhere, and then you have to get in there and start replacing stuff or tightening fittings. So you have to go to rides that have a fail-safe like that that's going to happen, something where it's like if you lose something, you'll collide trains like air pressure. You go to those rides first. And depending on how they are and how they're set, that's what you have to figure out what to do. Even if it's push pause on the thing. I say, how would you push pause on that? Well, if I have a train sitting in the station and a train in the reduction brakes, which is outside of the station, that means that train's typically sitting on a downhill slant. The older rides sit always on a grade. It's about 4 or 5% of a grade. And that's the reason why when they open the brakes, your train starts to roll forward, because it's rolling downhill. So you go out to those rides and you say, okay, there's one in the station, one in the brakes out there. All right, we need to work on an evacuation for this one because there's people in both locations. Okay, so what you have to do is you go out to the one in the brakes out there And what I would do is that in the infield, there's always SEP equipment, which was for evacuating rides. And in there, there's a lot of chains and hooks. So what I do is I would get my chains and I would go up to the top and I'd wrap a chain down around the back end of the train and then attach it to a track rib a little further back. And I do one for each side. So that way, if and or when that air pressure lets go, the train really can't go anywhere. It tries to roll forward just a little bit and the chains stop it. Now, these chains are really big, they're beefy, they would easily hold the weight of the entire train, but they weren't needed because it was only a 5% grade. Honestly, if you had like 6 mechanics out there, you could literally push the train backwards up that grade. So it wasn't a big deal. The chains we had were way overkill, but that was that. So we would go to those rides first. And then each park would have a priority of rides that they would go to first and say, oh my gosh, we got to go to these first. And then there's right underneath those priority ones, there's like a priority 2 where it's like, okay, nothing catastrophic is going to happen, but depending on how the ride operates, it could be in some really odd position where we also need to get to this one, not first thing, but second. Like, we need to get to this one quick because this is going to be a lengthy evacuation procedure or something like that. And then you go down to the third tier, which is typically something like, it's most of the time it's like kiddie rides and things like that. That's where something where the operator hits e-stop and the ride comes to a stop, and there's honestly no difference between a stop or an e-stop or a power outage. The operators can still go up there and let people off the ride if their SOP has trained them to do that. So where I work, the SOPs were pretty much written that if it happens, if the ride stops for some reason, they were instructed to press e-stop, and then they weren't allowed to do anything to that ride at all. They had to press e-stop, and then they had to call into a central command and say, my ride's having a problem, and then they had to stand there and just wait. They would announce to the people, yeah, we have a problem, there's something going on, and then they would just have to wait. They would have to sit there. I know other parks where their operations is like almost like maintenance. Like once the ride goes down like that, they have permission and they have training and procedures in place to actually go back through and try to restart the ride and try to get it back up and running. And if it can't be, most of the time they can perform their own evacuations as well too. The place where I worked, that wasn't the case. So what we would divide up into was basically maintenance and operations. Maintenance would divide into those like 2 top tiers. Okay, these are going to need assistance to open restraints, chain off trains, move platforms, run emergency generators and things like that, and get people off of the rides. And the tier 2s were just, I needed to go around to these priority tier 2 rides and check on their state and check and see if people needed to get unloaded or whatever it might have been at that point in time. And then operations would typically send their lower people out to the tier 3 rides. The tier 3 rides, the operations like kind of like leads would go out to those rides, and what they would have to do, since they were trained in lockout tagout, they would go up to the ride, these small kid rides, and they would simply just turn the incoming disconnect off. And they would hit the e-stop, turn their put their lockout on the ride really quick, and then just like unloading at the end of the cycle, they just make sure, okay, everyone gets off the ride. And then all the kids get off the ride, and they go, okay. And then they radio their central or call central, whatever it might be, and say, this ride is unloaded. And central command would sit there and record the ride, the date, the time that the ride went down, and then the ride, the date, the time that the ride was unloaded, and then eventually the ride, date, time that it was back up and running. So they knew all that information. So most of the kiddie areas during power outages are done by operations just because it was easy for them to do. They didn't have to do anything extra. There are plenty of things that nobody had to do anything at. Maybe they just happened to catch the ride during the loading, unloading process before they locked the restraints. If the restraints are powered, they didn't have to do anything. They just said, hey, we don't know what's going on right now. but the ride's down, you'll have to get back off, and everyone got back off the ride. That hits actually a fair number of rides throughout the park when that happens. At this point in the video, if you haven't already, please make sure you like and subscribe and give me some comments down there. Let me know if you've got any fun stories to add on to these. And then let me know if you want to see something for topics in the future too. I'm always up for new stuff. I've got a list of things that I'm making, but sometimes somebody says something and I'm like, oh yeah, let's do that one real quick. That really sounds like fun. I do enjoy getting that information. You guys come up with a lot of good ideas for videos, so let me know if you got them. You can also email me at ryantheridermechanic@yahoo.com. Let's get back into the video. So let's start talking about bigger rides. One of the questions that always comes up when people talk with me, I don't care how old they are, how young they are, whatever. One of the questions is always, well, what happens to a roller coaster during a power outage? And I have to clarify. I'm like, well, what do you mean? What happens to it? Because I'm thinking of the fuses blowing, circuit breakers tripping, PLC crashes, and you got to go in and reset it. It could be stuck on the lift hill. It's an underslung ride. Maybe you think of like a B&M Flyer where you've got to go let the seats back down to get people off, and all these other things in my head. And these people say, oh, does it just stop on the track right where it is? Like wherever it just sits, just like as soon as power goes out, it's like, woo, and it stops there? Oh. And I'm like, oh, no. Okay, so roller coasters work like once we go up and over the lift hill and we leave that lift hill, that's onto what's called free run track. The free run track means there's nothing in that ride's way. It is simply just energy, your kinetic, stored energy, potential energy, all those energies. It's all those energies working together, pushing that train around the track, gravity, that whole thing. And then that train is just allowed to go until it comes up to a brake section. Now, here's where your power comes back in. The power being there, the air pressure being there, and the programmable logic controller, or the PLC, saying everything is fine, keeps the brakes open and allows the train to pass through to the next block. The block is the thing that defines zone to zone. No two trains can occupy the block at one point in time, right? So as long as everything's hunky-dory, the brakes work the way they're intended to. Whether they be slowing brakes at the end of the ride, trim brakes in the middle of the ride, or block brakes that just stay open, just let the train pass by, they simply act as guardians. Everything is designed to do that. So when you lose power, well, you've lost your PLC OK signal, and you've lost your air compressor. So most of these brakes on these rides, actually, if you take the air pressure away from the brake closes, it shuts. So if you lose air pressure, you lose that brake. That works for rides that have you have a catastrophic failure, like you literally blow an airline apart and air can't get from one side to the other. All the brakes shut. But for a power failure, we don't have the power running through the processor to go out to all those coils and tell those brakes to stay open. So even though we might have a full tank of air pressure, those coils got the power removed and they told those valves to shut. And the valves changed state, the air bled out of them, the brake shut. So the ride now comes up to this brake and the train comes to a stop in it. And it's like, okay, they're going to be there for a little bit. So the bottom line is, what happens to a ride during a power outage, like a roller coaster during a power outage, is it stops, but it's in a braking zone or on a lift. It's somewhere it's designed to stop. If it's just out on the free run track, as soon as it crowns that lift, you could turn the disconnect off to the ride. It will continue to run the entire way. If it takes a minute and a half on the free run track before it comes back into the station or comes back into the brakes, then it will run that entire minute and a half, and no one on that train will know any difference at all whatsoever until that train comes into the next braking zone, and then their ride comes to an end at that point in time. Now you have all these people running around the park trying to unload rides. And yes, the rides where you have a train sitting in like a block break in the middle of the ride, or you have a train sitting on the lift hill or something like that. Yes, those rides do take priority. That's where you go to first. As soon as you get the oh my god rides out of the way, which are the ones that are the ones that fail without air pressure and stuff like that. As soon as you get those into a safe state, like the trains are chained off and stuff like that, then you can hit other high priority rides that may need more assistance. So that's pretty much what maintenance is running around doing now. And again, each power failure is unique. Each power failure is different. So it all depends on where that train happened to be. Is it just sitting in the middle of the lift hill where it's easy? You just go up and you bring your catwalk up, or you assemble your platforms, you do something like that, and then you can unload the train just fine from that point? Or is it something like, was it crowning the lift hill? And then right as it crowns the lift hill, the power died. That's probably one of your worst case scenarios right there, because a lot of times on the crown of the lift hill right there, at the very top where it curves over, a lot of times a lot of SEP or evacuation platform stuff doesn't reach that crown. When you look at nasty lift evacuations, if you Google things and say, oh, people were stuck on the lift for a long time and they had to get, maybe it was local fire department rescue out there, or special cranes or man baskets in to get up there and get the people off, it's typically because the train was stuck on that crown, and the standard evacuation platforms don't get up that high because the ride manufacturer intended it to stop there, not stop there. They intended it to stop at the lift park position, and that's the highest, like it was a block zone violation. So that's where they said, okay, the train will stop here. And then they said, well, what happens if the train goes past there? It's like, well, that's only for like a power failure, and then you'd have a train stuck really funky on the crown, not sure what to do there. So that particular scenario is, like I said, it's a really bad one. It's very unique. There's no real hard yes or no, this is the way it's going to go. If I had a train stuck on the crown up there and the power's out, I'm going to look at it really carefully, and I'm going to see where the center of the crown is. That's right there. I'm going to see where the center of the crown is, and then I'm going to see how much of the train is on both sides of it, to there, to there. Because what I'm looking at is I'm saying, well, if we got some come-alongs and stuff and come along the train, we could actually push it forward into the free-run track and then safely evacuate down at the brakes at the other side. But if this is one of those rides, like if it's a Vekoma ride, where you have dwindling air pressure now in your air system, and it's going to take you 25-30 minutes to push that train over the top, that's not a quick process, then I don't know what the air pressure is going to be in those trim brakes 30 minutes from now, 45 minutes from now. So we wouldn't want to risk that. That you would want to just opt to say, okay, we're right there, we're going to stop, we're going to figure out what's happening. Trains and lift hills in general, you can't really override the anti-rollback devices to let the train back down the lift hill. That's not really an option at all, because not only do you have 1, 2, 3, maybe even 4 anti-rollbacks on that lift hill, you have typically the chain doesn't want to go backwards either. It's got mechanical devices preventing it from going backwards. If you haven't seen my video on lift hills, take a look at that, and I go into all that stuff in detail on those videos. So you can't really roll it backwards because the lift hill is just not going to let you move a train backwards on it unless it was designed to do so. So your options are to either unload it right there on the crown or push it forward into the next set of brakes down there, depending on your air pressure. You could even do something like, if it's the really best way is to go forward to that next set of brakes and they aren't sure, you can even bring in a temporary air compressor if you're worried about it. A lot of rides have the ability, they have fittings and isolation valves on them, to where I could bring in even a small air compressor that just runs off of wall voltage, and I could hook it up to a generator and fire that thing up and just say, okay, go ahead, and it will supply air pressure to the ride. It can't do it with the intensity, the frequency that the ride needs to operate with that little tiny air compressor, but it can eventually take that entire system and push it up to the required operating pressure of the ride if you needed to do something like that. Realistically, with nothing else running, no air gates, no platforms, no brakes, no other effects and things like that running, air demand on the ride is pretty much nothing. So you can use a small air compressor and maintain that charge in the system. Because again, when it comes to brakes holding shut, all we care about is pressure, not volume. Does that make sense to anybody? So a line can have 150 psi inside of it, pushing all that pressure on those brake bladders and closing those brakes as hard as it can, but it has no volume behind it. You can literally go to Walmart and buy a little tiny air compressor for your car that's, just runs 12 volts DC. You plug it in, it just sits there and just this really stupid little thing. And it can create enough air pressure to run a ride. Absolutely. Yes, that thing can do that. No problem. Can it do it and run the ride like when brakes open and close and maintain that air pressure? No, it can't do that. It doesn't have the volume. So the air pressure is like water in a swimming pool, and the volume is essentially the hose that's filling the water in the swimming pool. So normally we have this swimming pool and we want to use all the air pressure inside of it to stop. It's okay, but the system bleeds, it leaks, it has to operate. So every time we stop a train, we lose 1,000 gallons of water out of that pool. Well, we have this really big hose, this huge hose, and we fill that pool back up. That's our air compressor with that big volume. And we fill that pool right back up to that level, and it's able to operate again. No problem for that air compressor. But then when we talk about putting this tiny backup one on, now it's like replacing that big hose of water with like a straw. It will eventually fill the pool back up to that level with that water, just a little tiny bit of fluid going in. But then as soon as you actuate it, all that goes down again. So, but in these cases, we don't care about the actuation. We just need the train to stop safely the way it was designed and intended to in that particular system. So you could do it with a backup air compressor. So when it comes to power outages, another question I always get from people is, do the rides have backup generators that allow them to run in a power outage? Most do not. Most do not have backup generators to them, and the ones that do have backup generators for special function. So special function is stuff like running a lift motor. The SLC I worked on had the big DC motor up on top, but it also had this little tiny motor that was used for evacuation and special scenario storage and things like that. So we could actually fire up a generator and it would run that motor. But the entire big generator we had downstairs was just to run that motor and that motor only, because it still was a beefy motor, but it was very small compared to the lift motor. So what we were able to do is we were able to fire up that generator and run that thing, and then we can go up there and use that smaller motor to basically turn the lift chain while it was working. In the last scenario I was talking about, where we had a thing crowned and stuck on the lift, I would simply just say, Mechanic A, go into the control room, verify the air pressure is up. Mechanic B, go into the trim brakes and verify the air pressure is up. And then I'm sitting up on top of the lift hill, and when they say yes, yes, I clear it with operations, and I hold that button to turn the lift chain back on. That's still a very slow moving process on the SLC. Very, very slow. But it will eventually push the train up and over that crown the rest of the way. But that's a very, very rare scenario. Extremely rare. By the way, Vekoma says not to do that. Again, these are rare scenarios. But generators on rides typically aren't meant to run the ride. It's not like something like, oh, the power is off, let's just fire up the generator and continue to run the ride. It's not meant to do it. The rides typically use too much power. So between the lift motors and booster drives, air compressors, and everything else needed to operate the ride, generators just don't have that unless you get a very big whole area backup generator, which a lot of parks don't do. Could do it, but they don't do it. Why? Because there's no reason to run a ride in a power outage at all. It's like, well, once the power goes out to the park, the whole park stops what it's doing. Why? It can't sell anything. So when the park power goes out, they say, well, you're welcome to stick around. We don't know how long it's going to be. And that's a true statement. They don't know how long it's going to be because that's out of their control completely. So at what point in time does the park say, well, that park has to kick people out? So that's a good question. Say, well, how long is it before you have to kick people out of a park when the power's out? Well, you don't have any rides running. So at an amusement park with no rides running, there's really no reason to stay in that park. But let's take it one step further, assuming there was a reason to stay in the park. What else could you do in the park? Well, all the cooking places couldn't cook because all their machinery requires electricity to cook food. Even gas-powered stuff, it still requires automation to move things. So you couldn't eat stuff in the park. Soda machines, things like that, they need power to operate. Now, water pressure, you have water pressure typically, even without power. Gravity areas, especially where you have gravity towers around the area feeding pressure and stuff, you typically have water and water pressure. So you can flush toilets, wash your hands, do things like that. So let's take a little closer look at that. When can we operate amusement parks? When can we not operate amusement parks? We can't operate amusement parks if the conditions aren't sanitary. That is a weird statement to make. How would you determine that? Well, the ability to wash your hands. That's the determination right there. It's like, all right, can you wash your hands? It's like, yes, I can wash my hands. It's like, okay, so let's take a food service place, because that's what we're going to boil this all down to, is food. We take a food service place and say, hey, can you wash your hands with the power out? It's like, yes, we can. It's like, okay, so you can wash your hands and you have a stockpile of food that's all saved up now, right? Yeah. So you can wash your hands and serve that food. Yeah, kind of. What do you mean kind of? Well, once the food drops below a certain temperature that we said that we were going to serve the food at, we can't sell that food anymore, because there's a criteria that has to be met. Even some colder stuff, once it gets between a certain area, they can't sell the food anymore. It's like, okay, so it's got to be on a warming tray. It's got to be on a warming table or something like that to maintain some parameter that's already been disclosed to the local food governance association, whatever it might be. So aside from that, let's go back to washing the hands again. So you can wash your hands, yes, and you're sanitary. Not quite. What do you do when you wash your hands? Oh, you put soap and water on, agitate them together. It's like, yeah, but what does the health department say about that? Well, they say you're supposed to use hot water. It's like, you're supposed to use hot water. Okay, so if we had water pressure, we have water to wash our hands, and if we had gas, natural gas, typically to use the water heater, you would have hot water. So if you were selling room temperature stuff that did not need heating or refrigeration and did not need to be cooked on an assembly line where, you have to electronics move things forward, backward. So if you were selling room temperature stuff, then you could theoretically continue to operate that in a power outage. But most places still wouldn't do that because they have no way to push that out on the register. They have no way to accept your Apple Pay and stuff like that. It's simply just like, okay, well, the cash register is down, so we still can't do it. And then the heating goes down, so they can't have that either. So you can operate an amusement park pretty much as long as you can maintain sanitary conditions in a power outage. As soon as you lose the ability to heat water, the park has to shut down for sure. Can't do it. It's got to be shut down. That's an interesting one. I wanted to put this scenario into place kind of and talk about a park, not mine. I just went out and thought of a park. I'm like, oh, I'll use this park. And I'm going to go through a power failure scenario on it. I can't speak to this park's equipment and operations and stuff like that. So This is just, I'm kind of just giving you those 3-tier levels. I'm kind of just giving you those 3-tier levels to determine what I would do at this particular park, judging by just as I go on the internet and grab their rides, grab some pictures of their rides, and I'm just like, oh yeah, this is okay, I would do this. So that's what I'm going to go over right now. The park I decided to use for this was Knoebels. Never been to the park myself. I hear people talk about it all the time. Looking at their ride package, it's got a nice ride package to it, so that's pretty cool. But I took their rides, just the visual pictures and stuff off of it, and what I could kind of just understand from a very quick glance, okay, it goes in this category, and I moved along. So I want to give you that list. First, I'm going to start off with my Tier 3 rides. Those are the ones that pretty much operations can unload in most scenarios, or they don't really require any real maintenance to get people off the rides. So these rides, I'll go over the names. We have the antique cars. Those are gas powered. You would only need power to run the signal lights on that and sell tickets if needed to go on those. Bumper cars, same thing. Just let them off. Hand cars, club cars, panther cars, motor boats. The flyer, just let them off. Flying tigers, the grand carousel, kiddie boats, kiddie bumper cars, kiddie fire truck, kiddie Himalaya, kiddie whip, the merry mixer, Pete's fleet, pony cars, rotojets, S&G carousel, Spanish bambini, teacups, tilt-a-whirl, tumbling timbers, umbrella ride, whipper, Cosmotron, and the Pioneer Train. Pretty much all those rides don't really require anything special to them. It would just be like turn them off, let the people off. It would pretty much for operations be just like their normal unload cycle. The next set I'm going to get into is kind of it's my Tier 2, but I've divided that into 2 sections also. Kind of the top of it is basically, these are rides that are just a normal, just standard, oh yeah, go ahead and let them off, like there's nothing big to them, but the way they operate, they could stop in such a way where you would need maintenance to get them off, for sure. And the second half of it is pretty much like, yeah, the majority of time, you're going to need help getting people off of this ride. The Ribbit. You could have to bleed the air and let them down. Red Barons and helicopters, Jet Skyfighter, Going Buggy. These were all rides that they have air cylinders that could stop and hold them up depending on how the ride is set up, because some rides, when you hit the stop, take power away, the air cylinders would maintain pressure. They wouldn't necessarily go up or down. So they'd kind of be stuck there. You'd have to bleed the air open and let the cylinders come back down. A lot of those older rides, especially older rides, they are pretty much just, once you hit the E-stop, it takes the air pressure away from the cylinders. That was the easy mindset there. So the rides naturally just come down. And then the last one is a crazy sub, which you need maintenance present, because that one you have to override the counterweights on the top of it to bring the crazy sub back down to lower position on that thing. Let's see, these ones will need maintenance assistance for sure. This is the Kiddie Wheel, Balloon Race, Tornado. Tornado should be hydraulically lowered. Super Roundup, Downdraft, Galleon, Giant Flume, Giant Wheel, Italian Trapeze, Cosmo Curves, Looper, Paradrop, Paratrooper, Satellite, and Skloosh. Mainly the majority of the rides in this list need some sort of maintenance intervention. A lot of them are hydraulically lifted. So when you have a hydraulic lifting base, that typically means when you take power away, they stop and they no longer lift, but no longer lower. So a lot of times on those rides, the balloons and stuff like that, you have to go in and use a hydraulic, you have to put an Allen key into the side of the cylinder or into the side of the valve and basically open a bypass that lets the hydraulic fluid go from the lifting arm and go back into the reservoir, and that slowly brings the arm or the center column, whatever it might be, back down to the lower position. So someone needs to show up there with some tools basically to open it up and let the thing back down. Okay, up at the top tier, these are rides that I can't say are immediate, like, oh my gosh, do you have to get to these? Again, it depends on how the ride stops. And I don't think they have any, judging by the looks of them, I don't think they have any ones that have any sort of air brakes or anything like that that would basically let trains crash into each other. So for that list, I have Twister. This is a wood roller coaster. It could be stuck in the brakes or stuck on the lift hill. Power Surge. This is you have to lower the arm down or possibly use a generator or something to open the restraints because they look like they're electronic driven. Black Diamond Indoor Roller Coaster. This is going to be tricky because you're going to be dark and there's lots of stopping segments inside there. So you're going to need multiple people to unload that one. That might be one of the nastier ones to unload during a power outage. Flying Turns. Freestyle toboggan coaster, basically release it from the brakes. There's not too much else in that. Phoenix wood roller coaster, again, stuck in the brakes, stuck on the lift hill. Impulse, this is a roller coaster with a vertical lift hill, so the vertical lift hills might pose a bit of an issue depending on how the ride is set up, whether it's just open the brake and let it back down, or if they're on a full anti-rollback rail, and then you would have to basically evacuate them from the lift, or maybe that ride might have a generator where you can push the coach back over the top and back into the track. Fandango, this is like a mid-size frisbee style ride, which not too much to them, but opening the restraints up on those things can sometimes be a real headache, depending on how it's set in and how their procedures are. It could be really nasty, so that one might be maintenance intensive to open the restraints up during a power failure. Haunted Mansions, dark ride. It's just a walker, so that would just be simply lock the ride out and let people off, but it would be dark and there's obstacles, so you're going to need, that's going to be a people eater. You're going to need multiple maintenance and operations to go through that one. And then Scenic Skyway. Skyways in general are not easy to unload because you have an entire string there. The unloading has to be coordinated typically through both sides of the station. The load side and unload on that, load and unload on that. And you typically need something like an emergency generator to run the motor or a backup motor to slowly bring those buckets back over and unload them. So the Skyway ones I've heard, I've never worked on one myself, put that up front, but I have heard from people that have worked on them and worked on them all the time that they are an absolute pain in the butt to unload during a power outage. Very lengthy process. Lots of communication needed. So when it came to some of those rides, you would say, well, why? I was talking earlier about how, like, when the arms are lifted up and you stop the ride, a lot of times the arm stays lifted, like flights and stuff like that, where your arms go up and down like this during the cycle, and then during this power outage, you had arms in the up position, and then you killed the power. And then a lot of them stayed in the up position like that. It's like, well, why would they do that? Why would they not just have them come back down? That was a mindset change early on. So the manufacturers used to do that. They used to say, okay, yeah, if they're up and then we hit the E-stop or we have a power outage or anything like that, it's very simple. The valves just change state and the planes or whatever it is comes back down and everyone's happy. Everyone gets off the ride. No big deal. No maintenance required. Awesome. That's great. What happened more and more was that kids' rides especially, kids would get away from the parents in the queue lines and stuff like that. They would run into these rides and they would run past the gates or whatever was holding the ride perimeter, and they would run into the ride perimeter now where the thing is rotating on the inside. And then all the planes or whatever it was are up in the air, and then the operator would hit E-stop. And then the planes would all come down at the exact same time, making it a really bad day for the little kid that ran in there or adult who ran in there, whatever it was. So it took a long time to do. And I don't even think it's a requirement these days. I think it's just something most manufacturers do. On a lot of rides that lift up into the air, you basically have an enabling valve that lets the air pressure pass from the tank through the other valving to the arm and lift it and lower it. Well, they take that enabling valve and they just shuttle it back into the neutral position, and then the arm can neither raise nor lower at that point. It's kind of just stuck in that area. But that is those scenarios when something's in there and you have everything up in the air and somebody runs in and your infield's compromised. They hit the e-stop and the thing does not come back down and injure whoever was there. They just stay up in the air like that and wait until you pull the e-stop back up or maybe hit a reset button or something, and then everything comes back down after that. Okay, I think I've spent enough time doing this today. I hope you've enjoyed the video. I hope you got some information out of it. Now you know what happens next time that a park experiences a power blip or a power outage. You kind of know what's going to have to happen in the background, and know that if the power instantly comes right back on, it's not necessarily business as usual for all the rides. So just a heads up, you might want to find something else to do for a little while. All right. That's it for this video. I'm Ryan the Ride Mechanic. Remember to like and subscribe, share, all that stuff. It does help me out, and I do appreciate it. All right, as always, stay off the air gates. Bye.